Alright, hello and welcome to this hopefully short Blender tutorial. Now this one is not necessarily something for beginners, but something that was specifically requested. Today we're going to look into how to add back planar wings or a planar representation of a wing to an animal where the wing has been fragmented during reconstruction. So here we already see the problem, the wing is highly fragmented. Now, also because of the viewing angle that we have here, we can see that having a planar representation of this fragmented wing is not the worst thing to have. So today I'm not going to talk about the general cleanup process. This is a more basic thing and also something that will probably then get its own video and its own properly documented video at some point. So I'm going to quickly bring this into Blender and then show you how to remove the wings and basically all the structure that we don't need in there. And then next, we're going to look into how in a photo editing software of choice, I'm going to use Photoshop just because I already have it, but any basic photo or image editing software will do, how we basically can then cut out the wing from one of our stacked images and then project that onto a planar texture, or onto a planar mesh, and then bring that into our actual 3D model. I'm going to talk about a few extra cleanup steps that we can do at the end in terms of actually reconstructing the entire shape of that, but more on that in just a second. So as this is just a casual tutorial, I'm not going to bother with displaying all the shortcuts that I press because it's first of all not going to be that many, and I will also assume that you have some basic understanding of Blender, you know how to navigate, and if anything crazy comes up, I will just tell you what I'm doing. All right, first things first, we need to get rid of all this stuff here, and as is tradition, we press A and then delete to delete the default cube. Now, I'm going to assume that you have already reconstructed your model where you then realized, well, I probably want some wings, and that will be exported in some format. Now, this might be in FBX, this might be in OBJ, whatever file format it is, go to File, and then import, and then select whatever file format you have. In my case, I have an OBJ, so I'm going to go to Wavefront OBJ. Wonderful. I'm just going to select the OBJ. The material file will be automatically imported if required. This might take a second, so let's quickly wait for that. Okay, we can see that our model has now been imported. I'm going to be using the numpad a lot to navigate back and forth. You don't have to do that, it's just quicker. So I'm going to use the numpad to first press 1 or press 3 to change my views in here. And now for just some very basic Blender basics, you basically will need 3 hotkeys or 3 basic button presses for all of these things that we're going to do here, assuming that you haven't used Blender all that much. So first of all, you can use by pressing the mouse wheel and then hovering your mouse around, you can change the way that you view at things. If you then press things on your numpad, so I'm going to press 3, for example, to get into this side view here. This is how I would change this view. And now for the 3 basic keys I just mentioned, that's going to be S and R and G. That's going to be scale and rotate. And well, G is move. Not sure what they thought there, but that's what it is. All right, first I'm going to press G once and then move that to the center. Now we can see this tiny orange dot there. Depending on the resolution in which you're viewing this, you might not be able to see this tiny orange dot. But that basically means that the center of mass and also the center of rotation of our object is located way outside. And we can quickly right-click our object and then go to Set Origin and then go to Origin Center of Mass, Surface or Volume, doesn't really matter here. And then you can see this tiny orange dot is now in the center there. And now that means if we now press R and start to rotate it, it will rotate around its center of mass, which is just very convenient. Okay, I'm just gonna roughly set that here, press G again to move stuff around, press R. It's just a process of going back and forth between G and R here, just to get that into the roughly right orientation. Now our mesh looks a bit choppy. It's gonna be just fine for these purposes. All right, one really basic step I will do right now. Well, first of all, we can have a look at the material. So this is the overall mesh. If we now press Z, so Z, depending on where you're from, and then select Material Preview, we can have a look at what the texture of this model actually looks like, and it already looks a whole lot more like an insect in just a second here. This is what our 3D scanned animal looks like. So this is also, if you're new to all of this, this is the kind of model quality that you can get with an older version of scAnt, because the new stacking algorithm also makes it possible to get a bit of a higher resolution for some of these things. Anyway, you can see the model looks like this. All right. Now we would like to, I'm just going to quickly go to shade smooth because it was for some reason not doing that. I'm going to remove this pin here, and then we will get to the actual process of reconstructing the wings. In Blender, when you hit tab, you can switch between the object mode and the edit mode. Right now we are in edit mode. So I'm quickly going to get rid of this pin right here. Not something that is the center of this tutorial, so I'm going to do this rather quick and dirty. The general idea is that I will just select some of these faces that we have here. So we'll also go to face select there. And then essentially perform a cut through all of that. Now, if I can find an orientation where I can just look through the entire thing, this is going to be even easier. So I'm going to press Z again, go to wireframe, and then I will press B to make a selection. And now I will just select this little chunk here, press delete, say faces, because if we do vertices, then some of these things, some of the adjacent faces might lose some of their points, and then we would have to rebuild them. That would be a bit annoying. Now we go back to material view so we can see what we have done. We can see that this is now separated from the main object. We can delete it in just a second, but let's first make sure that here we do what we need to do, which is just close this hole. So I'm just going to quickly select, this is a quick and dirty method here. There's other things which I will talk about in future tutorials which make all of this a bit cleaner, but we're going to assume that this is good enough for what we want to do right now. Okay, now that I've removed some of the extra faces here, I can now press Alt in Edge select mode. So out of these three up here, I select Edge, then hold Alt, then click on the edge, and we can see that it should now be entirely highlighted. If it's not completely highlighted, you either need to go back and delete further faces that basically protrude and make it impossible for Blender to recognize that this is a coherent edge. Another thing that you can do is you go to Mesh and Cleanup and then Merge by Distance, because if through your meshing process, it might happen that some of these faces become unconnected, then this will basically help to bring them together again. You just need to be mindful with the threshold that you choose there, because it can be that you overdo it. And then either you get issues and artifacts in your texture, or you lose some detail that you would have otherwise had in your mesh geometry. Anyway, this one is working here, so I'm going to go Alt and select exactly that. And then I'm going to press M for merge, and then I will just say at center. Now this is not very, very clean, because you can see the kind of geometry that you get with that, but it's going to be good enough for this very quick tutorial that we want to do today. And I'm going to head over from edit mode to sculpt mode, so I can just quickly clean this up a tiny bit. So we'll just briefly zoom out and paint over it a bit to get rid of this extra detail that we have here. And then what we could do is we could go back into the scan and then reproject some of the texture onto this part there, but this is again not the focus of this tutorial. Now I just want to delete the rest of this pin, so I will go back into edit mode. And again, wireframe will be our friend here. And now we just carefully, between the legs of this animal, select everything that is part of the pin and go delete vertices this time. Wonderful. Now we have something that we can actually work with. So I'm going to press 7 so we can have this in a top-down view. Now we want to replace this part here with a cleaner image texture. But one thing that we also need is we want to preserve this shape as well as possible. So in my example here, I'm gonna use this wing as a reference, and then from the stacked images that I have, I will recreate exactly this part here. Now, to make sure that as much detail as possible also in topology is preserved, or at least that we don't get any changes in aspect ratio, what I will do is I will take my model and then orient it to be as flat as possible towards the top. So when we then look down onto it, we can use that to basically reproject our model onto, to basically reproject our texture onto this exact area here. So now looking from the top, this will likely be good enough because this is an approximation anyway, and mostly for visual purposes, this should be just fine. Anyway, I'm now going to take a screenshot of this. So in Microsoft, we can just use our snipping tool, click new, and then I just want this as a reference. And I'm going to be saving that in my wing reconstruction folder. Apologies for many of these things just being a bit slow. I'm going to call this reference. You don't have to have the same name. Apologies for these things being a bit slow, but this is all running on my laptop because I'm kind of making this tutorial on the fly as I go. So we can close out of this one again, and we will get rid of all this extra geometry in just a minute. But as we are using this as reference, also when adding the wings back to the model, I'm going to leave this be for now. So here's our animal. So let's go out of Blender and into our photo editing software of choice. In my case, I already said that I will be using Photoshop in just a minute. And the thing that you now have to do is you have to select an image from your stacked images. So this is my folder from the reconstruction of this hoverfly. And in there, we have all the original high resolution images. And I already went ahead and I had a look through all the images that I have here. For many of these reprojection things, you will probably want to use some where you look down on the wing, where it is as unoccluded as possible. And ideally, it's also somewhat similar in the viewing angle as what we had in our reference image, because otherwise we will have to apply more transforms to it. And that would essentially just lead to us making more things deformed than there really need to be. So I already copied over the photo that I'm going to use as well as the reference, and I'm going to open both of them in Photoshop. So now in this file here, again, we're just going to assume this is perfectly planar, which is an incorrect assumption, but it's going to be good enough for what we're going to be doing here. So now all we really need to do is cut out this wing here and then paint out any differences that we get where we have parts of the texture that are the animal and not the wing that is above it. So I'm going to select the pen tool, but, well, in my case, it's the Zeichenstift-Werkzeug, because for some reason this is a German version of Photoshop, and please don't ask me why. And I'm just going to draw around the wing here to make my selection. Also, getting good at using the pen tool goes such a long way in so much of editing software, because it's going to be so useful for any roto work that you will be doing. So I'm not going to tell you exactly what I'm doing here now, not because I have crazy secrets, but because I don't know which software you're going to be using. So in my example with Photoshop here, again, it's just the pen tool, and you can add these little handles here to draw nicely around the kind of structure that you're going to reconstruct here. Now this one, we do see this element being somewhat folded up. I'm just going to be assuming, which is again not very accurate, but it's going to be fine now, final reconstruction, that this is just going to be part of the wing. Wonderful. Now we have our selection, and we can actually start cutting this out. So again, this might be different in your software. I'm just going to make a selection of that by heading over to the paths and then going to the selection. And now I'm just going to head back over to my layers or Ebenen and press Ctrl J to make a copy of just that part. And this will be what we will be working with for our actual wing. Now, a few things that we can already do is we see that we got these, the edge here looks fine, but we do have some more animal in there than we would want in our actual wing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up these areas here as much as possible. I will also speeding this process up a bit because again, this is going to be somewhat specific to the software that you're going to be using. In Photoshop, what I will essentially do is I will try to select these areas here as cleanly as possible. So after having made my selection, I'm now using the Band-Aid tool or the Bereichsreparaturpinsel, beautiful, to basically just paint over this a couple of times until this has mostly filled in the same kind of somewhat random texture that we get from the outside as well. Now we can spend as much time on this as possible, but as this is more of a, this is going to be used for presentation reasons rather than for further scientific purposes, I'm not going to spend crazy amounts of time to perfectly recreate all of this here. All right, and that's going to be good enough. Now we have our wing. Now, an extra thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we also recreate this shape here again. So I'm actually going to take this image here and drag it onto our other composition. And now I'd like to get this to roughly the same size. Then we're going to start moving the wing around. Now, the only reason why I'm saying we want to have roughly the same size is so that we use the maximum resolution that we can get from our original image and bring this onto this one here. All right, this is roughly the same size. Wonderful. So we can just use this as our background layer now. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use our wing that we had just cut out and cleaned up and try to fit this shape as well as possible. Now, because in both cases we roughly use the same perspective, this shouldn't take too much effort. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set down the opacity slightly, just to 75%, just so that we can see what's happening underneath and make sure that the edges are lined up nicely. So in whatever software you're going to be doing this, you might have slightly different shortcuts. For me, this is just Control-T, so we can start this transform process here. And now I'm going to use these handles to basically drag this into roughly the right shape that we have without applying any deformation that isn't in the actual model. And without too much faff, this is now our reconstructed wing. Now we obviously want to go back to our full 100% opacity. And what we also want to do is we don't want this entire image, because afterwards we're going to be using this as a planar image texture. So it's going to be easiest for us if we then also crop our image to just what we need. So in our case, I'm going to crop this down to be just the wing. And I don't want this to be any specific proportions. This is just a Photoshop thing. Ugh. Exactly. So now we bring this down to be exactly just our image texture. Wonderful. And now we have our cutout wing that we can introduce back to the model. So I'm just going to be saving this as a PNG, because what we absolutely want is to actually, I'm going to export this. Because if we don't have that, it's difficult to tell Blender what to use as part of our reprojected texture and what not. Now, before we add our wing in Blender, one thing that we can quickly check is the resolution of our image, because we can use that to get the right aspect ratio so we don't introduce any deformation in here. So we have roughly 1.5 times 0.7. So when we go into Blender now and then press Shift and A to add mesh and then plane, after we edited our object, we can go into the dimensions and say match the resolution that we have. So we go to 1.537 and 0.733. And now, by dragging up here, we can go to Shader Editor with our plane selected, then create a new shader. This will allow us to bring our material onto this one here. And now with Shift A again, because Shift A is what we use to add new things, go to Input, and then we go to Texture, and then Image Texture. The color can already be connected to the base color in the principal shader here. We go to Open, and from our wing reconstruction folder, we're going to use the wing reprojected. Now you can already see that if we move this kind of to the side, we already have our image in here. Now, one extra thing that we can immediately do to make this more realistic is, well, we also have our alpha channel, because this is a PNG, or well, any image format that does support alpha channels, and plug that into the alpha, and then whatever is not part of the wing will be basically blurred out. Now you can see, oh, this looks like we still have all of that in there, but that just depends on the rendering mode that you're in. So if we head over to cycles and then actually go into rendered mode, we can see that now this is no longer part of this element there. And when we then start to move our plane around, we can see that only the wing is part of exactly that. I'm going to show you a few extra tricks in just a second to make this wing look more realistic, and also in terms of making sure that you do actually, that the wing actually becomes transparent again. But more on that in just a second. For now, we need to make sure that we can line up this part well with the model and then get rid of any extra mesh geometry that we have. Basically all these fragmented parts there, we just want to delete them. So I'm going to be heading back into the material preview, so it's going to be easy to line this up with the model. So for now, I'm just going to move this over because we don't need to look at it. Now in our top-down view, we can already do the first basic thing, which is we rotate it and then just rotate it to the side. Now, because we want to have two identical wings, we can hold with our wing selected, Shift and D to make a copy of it. And then by pressing M, and then by pressing Control M, we can mirror our object. Now we just need to define in which plane we would want to do that. In our case, that is the X plane. So press G again and move that one over, because we're going to be fitting that one to the animal in just a second as well. And now we can see, well, it's kind of at an angle, so we can roughly replicate that here right away. Again, I'm using R to rotate the object and then G to move it around. Bring that image plane up here, try to match this as well as possible. I'm going to adjust the scale in just a second. And then basically just iteratively by scaling, so S, and then changing the scale, getting this to a point where this nicely lines up with our model. Yeah, we're already getting somewhere here. We just need to be sure that this is at the right size. And this is now, like many of these elements covered in this tutorial, much more an artistic process than it is science or engineering, because we essentially just carefully make these updates until we are happy with the way that it fits our model. Actually, we can see that this is slightly... All right, this is probably going to be good enough for this side here. So now we're going to repeat this kind of process with the other image plane as well. So we're just going to select it, give it a first initial rotation that we're mostly happy with, and then bring it down in scale, because right now it's slightly larger than we need it to be. So again, I'm just using G to move things around, R to rotate, and S to scale. All right, and now I'm going to say I'm happy with this approximation. So if we now go into rendered view, we can see that this mostly lines up with our wings quite well. And in a second, we're going to get rid of the extra geometry. But just to be able to actually see what's happening here, we can just crank up the brightness a little bit. And yeah, this is half decent, but it's going to take a tiny bit extra adjustment. So if your computer can handle that, it can actually be good to do that in rendered view, because then you can see the transparency right away before making any more updates. Right, and I'm mostly happy with this right now. So let's do the last bits of the mesh cleanup process. Right now, I'm selecting both of these planes, and then up here, I can just hide them in terms of their visibility. Now we can actually go into editing the last bits on this mesh. Now, again, because we want to edit things, we are in edit mode right now. Now, one handy thing that you can do is when you have selected a point on your mesh, you can go to Control L to select everything that is connected to that point. The L in that stands for linked, I reckon. And now that we've selected all elements that are linked to the original one, we can also press Control I to invert our selection. And that basically gets us all the things that are not directly connected to the mesh. And in our case, we're going to assume that this will be all the artifacts being part of the wing or extra floating objects that we had in our mesh. We're going to just delete them and say delete vertices. Now we can see that there's a few floating elements still part of the mesh that kind of ruin the aesthetic here, and want to clean them up as much as possible. Now, we're not going to go into great detail in terms of how this mesh cleanup process would work, because this will be a separate tutorial. So for now, I'm just going to delete many of these animals here and then collapsing the geometry onto itself. Same thing as we've also done for the pin underneath. So no new techniques. This is just getting rid of some extra stuff and then using a little bit of sculpting afterwards to clean it up. So I'm going to speed up this process here. Now, just to briefly summarize what is happening here, I'm basically just selecting all the areas that I want to get rid of and do that iteratively. And then I just close the holes that are caused in the mesh the same way as I did for the insect pin as well. And then after I'm done with that, any noise that was added through that process or just general noise in the mesh that I want to get rid of, I'm just using the basic sculpting tool, specifically the smoothing or the inflate tool, to get rid of. And that is basically the entire thing, and perhaps also the most manual thing that you might have to encounter during this kind of cleanup process. Now the elements projected down onto the animal we're going to leave as is. In some workflows, what we may also do is basically take some of the adjacent texture and project it back onto this area. But for now, we basically only care about that the wings that we had once before are mostly deleted from the mesh, and only the attachment points remain, so we know exactly where to place our newly reprojected wings onto the mesh. The last thing I'm going to do is close these holes on either side. And one last time going into sculpt mode to slightly smooth out the geometry that we've created. Now zooming out again and bringing back our previously hidden wings, we're getting pretty close to something that we're ready to share. Now here we're going to, in both cases, head into rendered mode and then slightly change the rotation of our wings so they fit nicely to our model. And now that all the extra geometry is out of the way, we have a better way of telling where exactly that should be in the mesh. And that already gets us pretty close to what we would finally like to have in our model. And finally, we can do a few things to increase the realism of the way in which our wings look. So to do that, we're going to head over to rendered view, just so that we can see how the material is actually finally going to be displayed. And we can already see, well, I mean, right now they're 100% opaque. And while that's good in terms of making sure that we can clearly see them, it's not necessarily the way that we would want to have them appear, because also the real animal would have translucent wings. So now, looking back into the way that we create our image material here, we just select one of the wings, or if you already have the material up, you don't even have to do that. And in here we can see the structure that we built earlier. We just have our original image that then feeds into the color and also into the alpha channel. And now, in order to see what we're actually doing here, we can go over here to our world properties, and then for the color, just dial this all the way up. So, well, this looks a bit overexposed, but this is fine for now because we need to make some adjustments. Right now we can see that these wings are 100% opaque, so they will completely occlude whatever's happening below them. And this means that we can make some adjustments to the way that our alpha layer here works. So because these wings are quite thin, we can assume that there's some base transparency to everything in there. So in our shader editor, we press Shift A to add a math node. And then we basically can just put this over here, set this to subtract, and now just go to 0.2 roughly. So we get some level of base transparency in there. If this is too high for us, we can also slightly bring this way down. But now another thing that we can also do is not just use the transparency in terms of the alpha layer, but also use the transmission. So we have a control over how the image is refracted within the wing. So we add yet another math node. So search and math. And this time we're using the color channel and plug this into the first value, not the alpha channel, the color channel. And then this value goes into the transmission. What this will basically allow us to do is to use the intensity of these colored elements here to guide how transmissive certain areas are. If they are dark, they're not going to be very transmissive. If they are light, so the value is high, they're going to be very transmissive. And this is what we can essentially see here already with the color underneath being able to bleed through the lighter areas, but not so much through the darker areas. And we can dial in the intensity of this effect, again, by using this math node here. So right now I think it's a bit too transmissive almost, so I'm going to bring this down to 0.2. And this gets us pretty close to the look that I would finally like to have. So let's call this a day and a project that we have completed. One last thing we can now do is export our model and view it in whatever model viewer we would like to have afterwards. So I'm just going to go to File, and export, and well, this can be, for example, an FBX file. Now, one important thing we need to do when we do these kinds of exports is say for the path mode, we want to have copy and then enable this one here. This just makes sure that all the image textures are also included in the final file. So when we then upload them to external sites, for example, these things are still in there. We can just hit export FBX, and there we go. We now have our untitled FBX. I'm just going to be calling this like the animal that we worked with. And let's open it up and hope that everything has been set up correctly. And there we go. This is what our final model looks like. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and because this is only for a select few people, don't like and subscribe. Don't share this. This is just for you. Be happy that you got secret extra information. All right. See ya. Bye. All right, so just a very tiny addition. After I finished recording, I played a bit more with the node setup and realized there is perhaps a combination that I liked even better. So if you want to have exactly the look that I have here in this example render, this is what the node tree then looks like. It only has 2 additions. Everything else is pretty much exactly the same. So the only thing that I've done differently here is I connected the color channel additionally to the roughness channel, saying darker things should be more shiny and lighter things should be less shiny. This is just a stylistic choice. But then what I additionally did is I updated the alpha channel a bit. So first of all, I increased the transmission a tiny bit to 0.3. And then for the alpha channel, I also included the color information there. So I first inverted the map, saying that everything that is light should be very, very transparent. And everything that is dark should not be transparent. And then I combined that additionally with the alpha channel of the image itself to basically say that, well, everything that is a 0 value in the color channel is also what is transparent, just so that these are correctly combined with one another. And I used a multiply node by that, meaning that only things that are part of the wing and nothing that is part of the background can be actually displayed in the alpha channel. Now, this is something that you really don't absolutely have to do. It's just something that I thought looked pretty, and that's why I wanted to include it. All right, that's enough. Bye.